Welcome everybody to the September Adaptation in Action webinar series. I'm Jamie Mosel. I'm with the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, and we're super excited to have Scott Hirschberger here today. They're going to be talking about climate adaptation menus for maple syrup and beyond. And Scott is a science communicator, a project assistant with the Wisconsin Extension Maple Syrup Program, and they're also a master's student as well. So we're very pleased to have Scott here today. And just to share some upcoming events, we've got our monthly webinars, so look for the announcements about that. And then next month in October 25th to 27th, we'll have our Midwest Climate Resilience Conference in Duluth. So we're very excited about that. A couple friendly reminders. So the webinar will end at 1 p.m. and all participants will be muted during the presentation. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and the webinar will be recorded and posted on our MCAP YouTube channel at a later date. Just some information for the Q&A. So as I mentioned, you're all muted right now. So please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of Scott, or if you have any logistical questions, I can help answer those. You can also type your own question or upvote a question that you would also like to see answered. And then we've enabled the chat for this presentation because we'll ask you to pop in some information about yourselves and where you're coming from shortly. And so I'm very, very pleased again to introduce our presenter for today, Scott Hirschberger. As I mentioned, Scott is a science communicator, also a project assistant with the Wisconsin Extension Maple Syrup Program. And Scott is also currently a master's student in life sciences communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we're really, really privileged to have Scott here today, and I'll hand it over to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. All right, let me get my slides pulled up here. Okay. Perfect. All right, well, hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here to talk with you about maple syrup and climate change and adaptation menus. As Jamie said, I'm the project assistant with the Wisconsin Extension Maple Syrup Program. This is a program that's pretty new. It just started in 2022 and funded by the USDA. And the broad goals of the program are to support maple syrup producers in Wisconsin and encourage new people to start production, help existing producers grow their production if that's something they want to do. So I've been doing some social science research with the program, analyzing survey data. I've been running Facebook advertisements, blog posts, and I created the adaptation menu that I'm going to share with you all today. So I'm not an expert in maple syrup production or in forestry, but I've been on this project since January. I've been learning a lot about the maple syrup world. So the perspective that I really bring to this is as a science communicator, which is a term that might mean different things to different people. So to me, science communication is all about the interface between science and society. I spend a lot of time thinking about how we talk about science in the media, in pop culture, in politics and policy. And there's a lot that we can learn from social science as far as what makes for effective science communication. So that's what I'm studying in my master's program. And I'm particularly interested in the role of communication in climate change adaptation and mitigation, because all the best scientific research in the world will not solve the climate crisis. We need good communication in order to put ideas into action. So for our time together today, I have two main goals. First, I'm going to talk about climate change and maple syrup production as sort of a case study, and I'll dive into the adaptation menu that I created. And then building off of that, I'll talk about some broader communication lessons for creating and rolling out climate adaptation menus. So first rule of effective communication is to know your audience. So with that in mind, we're going to be launching a brief poll here. So I'd like for you to fill that out, please, and that'll help me tailor my talk to your particular knowledge and interests. And as you finish that up, it would be great if you could also put in the chat where you live and how your work or your interests relate to climate adaptation. I'd be very curious to hear about that from everyone. And I can't see the results of the poll yet, so I don't know how many responses have come in, by the way, Jamie.
So far, we have 10 out of 15.
Okay.
Leave it up for just another minute or so, and then we'll close the poll. Looks like people have stopped responding. I will close the poll and share the results.
Good. Okay, let me take a look at this. So people are mostly slightly or moderately knowledgeable about maple syrup production. We do have a couple people who've produced maple syrup, 4 people, and then people who are slightly and very knowledgeable about climate change impacts forest in them. Okay, very cool. This is very helpful. And looks like a lot of people are about equally interested in the 2 halves, with some folks a little more interested in the maple syrup part. So I'll focus more on that. Okay, excellent. Thank you, everyone. So for those of you who don't know much about maple syrup production, let's start with some background on that. So as I talk about this, you'll kind of see hints of where climate change comes into play, but I'll dive more into that when I'm talking about the adaptation menu. So maple syrup production is a unique activity here in North America. It's not done anywhere else in the world. Canada is really the powerhouse in North America. Within the US, Vermont is the top maple producing state, but production happens all over, including here in the upper Midwest. The data that you're seeing is from the USDA, and they only collect data on the top 7 syrup producing states each year. And then every 5 years, they collect data on the others. So that's why the most recent data from Minnesota is 2017. And in that year, Minnesota production was about 19,000 gallons. And in Wisconsin, I know from my work that there's a lot of potential for growth of maple syrup production. And I imagine that it's similar in Minnesota and elsewhere too. So it all starts with the trees. There are several different species of maple trees that can be tapped for syrup. The most common being the sugar maple. This is the iconic maple leaf that you see on the Canadian flag and elsewhere. And this one is the favored tree mainly because it has the highest sugar content in the sap, but there are others that can be used as well. And one that's relevant for adapting to climate change is the red maple. So we'll be talking about that later on. And when you think about producing maple syrup, the health of the trees is really important. So healthy trees, especially those with deep, wide crowns, are typically going to be the ones that will produce more sap and a higher sugar concentration. So thinking about climate impacts, anything like drought or extreme rainfall or invasive species that are going to be putting stress on forest ecosystems in general are going to potentially harm maple syrup production. So producers collect sap by drilling holes in the tree, typically just 1 hole per tree, but some producers will use 2 taps in a larger tree. And this does not harm the trees long term when it's done properly. And the tapping happens shortly before the season starts. And that season is in late winter. And it's really dependent on temperature conditions. So you need the nights to be below freezing and the days to be around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And ideally, that cycle happens several days in a row to get a good sap run. And ideally, you'll have several good sap runs in a season. So in Minnesota, the average maple syrup season is around March 15th to April 20th. There's a lot of variability from year to year. And as we'll see with climate change, this is becoming a little earlier on average in the calendar year. Producers can use a variety of equipment to collect sap. The 2 most common are buckets and bags, are kind of the low-tech method. Works perfectly well. You get about 10 to 12 gallons of sap per tap. As producers grow larger, they often start using tubing systems. And if they add a vacuum pump onto that to decrease the pressure within the tubes, they can double their sap yields to more like 15 to 30 gallons of sap per tap. And production really does happen on a very wide range of scales. So you'll have your hobbyists who are collecting sap from just a handful of trees or maybe up to a couple hundred trees. And then you'll have commercial producers who are maybe tapping 10,000 trees or more. And that's common in the Northeast and in Quebec. Now, once you have the sap, you have to concentrate it and boil it, which is a major step because coming out of the tree, the sap is typically around 1 to 3% sugar. But to become syrup, it needs to be 66 to 68% sugar by mass. So you're removing nearly 99% of the water. The rule of thumb is that it takes about 40 gallons of sap to yield 1 gallon of syrup. So this is it's a big process. And producers who tap a couple hundred trees or more will often use a reverse osmosis system to speed up this process that can extract more than 80% of the water, bringing the liquid to about 12 to 20% sugar. And then after that, you boil the syrup. You boil the sap into syrup. And again, there are a variety of equipment choices that you could make, different evaporators you could use depending on the scale of your production. And this process takes hours, and wood is the most common fuel, but you can also use oil or gas or propane. So when you're thinking about in terms of maple syrup production's impacts on climate change, the fuel source is a factor there. But that's not going to be really a focus of what I'm talking about today. And then the last step is to filter and bottle the finished syrup, and you have to hot pack it at about 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit so that there's no bacterial growth. So that's a quick overview of the maple syrup production process. Now let's talk about how that connects to climate change and the adaptation menu that I created. So I created this, again, as part of my work with the Wisconsin Extension Maple Syrup Program. And I started by basically reading a lot of research on climate impacts on northern hardwood forests and maple trees specifically. I interviewed some folks with forestry backgrounds, some maple producers, and I synthesized all that information into something accessible and usable for maple producers in the upper Midwest. So before showing you the menu, I want to talk about concept of an adaptation menu to make sure we're all on the same page about that. So first of all, it's a document that presents possible strategies for adapting to environmental changes. And it's very much focused on actions, giving people concrete things that they can do. An adaptation menu builds on the user's knowledge of the land, doesn't replace that knowledge. The idea is that people using the adaptation menu are having experiences interacting with the land, and the adaptation menu connects those lived experiences to broader trends, to scientific research, to different strategies that other people have tried and had some success with. And it's important to note that an adaptation menu is not prescriptive. It does not dictate some sort of best strategies. That's why it's called a menu. The idea is that the users get to select the actions that make sense for them based on their situations and goals. And there are a couple other adaptation menus that are relevant for maple producers in Wisconsin and really across the upper Midwest. The Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has a very detailed adaptation workbook that they've produced that includes adaptation menus for a variety of ecosystems, including forests. So I'll stick the link to that in the chat. And then there's also a tribal climate adaptation menu that was created incorporating Menominee and Ojibwe perspectives. And that includes some discussion of maple sugaring as well. So I will add that to the chat as well. Okay, so within the adaptation menu, there are some common themes that emerge on ways that producers can address climate impacts. Broadly speaking, there are two categories of actions. The first one relates to forest management, so how producers are caring for the health of the ecosystem in general. And then the other category is the technology and business side of collecting sap and turning it into syrup. So in that first category, a big takeaway that's really a through line through the menu is that a diverse woods is more resilient. And here I mean this in terms of species and ages and sizes and spacing. All of those things contribute to a healthier ecosystem that is better going to be able to bounce back from any challenges that it faces due to climate change. And I'm sure that we've all heard similar statements about other ecosystems, and the same thing is very much true when you think about maple syrup production. On the business side of things, I mentioned sugar maples and red maples. A lot of producers focus on sugar maples, and for those who don't yet tap red maples, doing so is something that's worth considering. Red maples are expected to flourish in the Midwest in the coming decades. They can tolerate a wider range of moisture conditions and don't need as nutrient-rich of soil. And they can really be just as good for sugar making as sugar maples. And for actions in both of these broad categories, sometimes they can get expensive, but there are financial and technical assistance options available. There are some cost share programs that folks can look into through the Natural Resources Conservation Service or the DNR or other local programs. And we always encourage producers to work with foresters to create land management plans and think about how to navigate these different considerations. Okay, so let's take a look at the adaptation menu. So the link is there on the screen, and I'm putting it in the chat as well. So I structured this particular menu around 8 different environmental changes that maple producers might be experiencing now and might experience even more in the future. And throughout the menu, as you'll see, there are a lot of links where people can learn more. So if there are any of the climate impacts that I talk about that you want to learn more about, we did do a webinar with the Maple Syrup program back in August that featured a climate change specialist with the U.S. Forest Service talking in much more detail about those impacts. So I'll just give kind of a briefer overview of that today. And the first set of changes that I'll discuss relate directly to changing climate conditions. So the most basic of those changes is rising temperatures. As I'm sure we all know, temperatures are on the rise. And here in Minnesota, there's a difference between the southern part of the state and the northern part of the state, where the northern part of the state is warming faster than the southern part. And the northern part of the state is where the habitat is more suitable for maple trees and maple syrup production. And this is true across the upper Midwest. And the difference is even more striking when you break this down by season. So the winter low temperatures have risen by 7 degrees Fahrenheit on average in northern Minnesota in the past 120 years or so. And average summer highs are rising as well, but not nearly as quickly. So focusing in on those winter temperatures, that is affecting the timing of tapping seasons. As I mentioned, tapping seasons are very dependent on weather conditions. And so if temperatures are warmer in general, that means the tapping seasons are going to be shifting earlier in the calendar year, and they're becoming harder to predict as well. And so the actions that we suggest to producers, first of all, relate to just being aware of this trend and knowing that they may need to get out in the woods and start tapping trees sooner than they did in the past. And then thinking about sanitation is helpful because you can't just compensate for this shift in seasons by tapping your trees really, really early, because over the course of the season, bacteria and yeast grow in those tap holes, and that causes the sap flow to decrease. And at the same time, the tree is starting to kind of heal itself and compartmentalize the wound. So you still want to be able to tap just right before the season begins. So we provide some links to good sanitation habits, and following those will help producers be a little bit more flexible in terms of when they start tapping. And then also, if they're at a size where it makes sense to consider tubing, another reason to consider using tubing is because it tends to be more sanitary than buckets and bags. So along with those winter warming temperatures, we're also seeing more winter precipitation coming as rainfall rather than snowfall. And this isn't universal. There are some places that so far are having more snowpack than they used to, but in the places where there's reduced winter snowpack, that's a concern for sugar maples because they have fairly shallow roots and depend on that snowpack for insulation. So without that insulation, there's a risk of frost damage. And then at the end of the winter, as the trees are starting to bud out during the beginning of spring, if there's a late frost, that could damage the trees because they're already preparing for spring, then suddenly it's below freezing again. And so these two issues are not ones that you can really address directly. You can't just add a huge artificial snow cover to your woods. So this really ties back into the idea of making your woods resilient however you can. So we provided some resources for producers to know how to monitor the health of their woods and work with foresters to create a forest management plan. And then the other thing to consider here is that forest management activities often require heavy machinery, and to avoid damaging the soil, that heavy machinery needs frozen or at least dry ground conditions. So keeping that in mind when scheduling forest management activities is really important. Turning now to the summer temperatures that are on the rise. There's been some research that's finding a general trend where after a particularly hot summer, the sugar content of the following season sap may be lower than normal. And so this obviously is a concern because the lower the sugar content of the sap, the more time and energy and money you're going to have to devote to boiling it into syrup. So this is all about energy efficiency. So there's an energy self-assessment that producers can take, which we've linked to in the menu, to help them identify specific ways in their operation that they can make it more energy efficient. And some of those common ways include using a reverse osmosis machine, using a preheater, which basically uses some of the heat from the evaporation to heat the sap that's coming into the evaporator, or just a more energy efficient evaporator in general. And this is a case where there are some cost share programs that specifically allow maple producers to adopt more energy efficient techniques and equipment. And we did an entire webinar on that topic with folks from NRCS. So I'm putting the link to that in the chat if that's something that you would like to learn more about the nitty-gritty of how to apply for those programs. And on the forest management side, thinking about thinning your stand to give your trees space to grow deep, wide crowns can be beneficial here, since, as I mentioned, those trees do typically have a higher sap sugar concentration, but there still is a lot of variability from tree to tree and day to day and year to year. And then value-added products, so things beyond just syrup, things like candies or creams, cotton candy. There's a lot of different fun products involving maple syrup or maple sugar that producers can make that potentially have a higher profit per unit of sap. And then another trend related in large part to the rising temperatures is that sugar maple habitat is shifting northward gradually. What you're seeing in this map is the predicted relative abundance for potential suitable habitat. It doesn't mean there will necessarily be maples growing in all of these regions. But what you'll notice is that in northern Minnesota and the upper Midwest in general, we're still in pretty good shape as far as the range of the sugar maple. We're not at the southern end. And so this isn't as big of a concern for us as it is down in like Kentucky and West Virginia, where there are some producers who are already reporting that conditions are just really not allowing them to tap and make syrup anymore the way they used to. But for those producers who are thinking long-term and want to take this into account, thinking about microclimates on their land, things like north-facing slopes where temperatures are rising more slowly than south-facing slopes, focusing on tapping the trees in those areas or making plans to do so decades in the future. That's one potential possibility for how to adapt here. Okay. Now, in addition to rising temperatures, climate change is causing more drought and extreme rainfall across the upper Midwest. And a lot of you probably already know about this, but for those of you who don't have kind of clear in your mind how both of these things could be happening in the same place, here's a couple reasons why. So first of all, the extreme rainfall is becoming more extreme and more concentrated. So instead of being spread throughout the year, the rainfall is coming in these short little bursts And that's an issue because the rainfall then will just run off the soil. It won't replenish soil moisture as much. And then you can have flood damage as well. And at the same time, when you have rising temperatures and longer growing seasons, then there's more transpiration from leaves and evaporation from the soil. And so then this vapor pressure deficit increases. And that's basically the difference between how much moisture is in the air versus how much could be in the air at 100% humidity. So this is going to put more drought stress on trees, which is obviously a forest health issue. So again, a lot of the actions that we recommend here relate to forest management and monitoring the health of your woods, encouraging a diversity along all the dimensions I mentioned. And when thinking about floods and erosion, it's important to follow best management practices when you're building and maintaining roads and trails and culverts in the woods. And so we've provided links to some of those really detailed best management practices. And there's also a resource on how to manage flood damage to trees. And I believe that is from the University of Minnesota Extension, in fact. And then a last thing to mention here is that removing dead or dying trees can help give the healthier trees room to grow vigorously. But that is a trade-off because the dead and dying trees do provide valuable wildlife habitat. So again, with the idea of this being a menu where some actions make more sense for some people than others, some of these things are trade-offs, so all different things to consider. Okay, now the last kind of several sets of impacts I'm going to talk about relate to things that are happening in the ecosystem because of climate change that then have an indirect influence on maple trees and maple production. The first one being that climate conditions are causing deer populations to rise in many parts of the Midwest, and deer like to munch on baby trees, and that hinders forest regeneration. That makes it harder for new sugar maples to grow in the forest. And deer browsing doesn't threaten mature maple trees, but deer do sometimes chew on tubing systems and cause damage that way. So the main adaptation actions here relate to keeping the deer out somehow, building an exclosure, building barriers with treetops when producers are going in and harvesting timber. And the feasibility of that does depend on the size of the plot of land that you're talking about. So if you are specifically wanting to encourage regeneration in one specific section of the woods, maybe you just put an exclosure there rather than around your entire sugar bush. And if building an exclosure isn't really feasible, food safe deer repellent spray is also an option. This isn't a perfect solution. You will have to reapply it during the season, and it won't completely eliminate browsing, but it will help. And again, there might be some cost share programs available to you for these sorts of forest management practices. And then in a lot of ecosystems, including in forests, we're seeing more invasive species because the changing climate conditions are favorable to them, and human activity is helping to spread them. And these species include plants and animals and diseases that can either compete with maples or directly harm maples. So the adaptation menu provides links to a variety of information, both at the national level and at the state-specific level, on current invasive species and how to recognize them. And we recommend reporting them as well. Whenever people see them, that will just help us collectively know what's happening and kind of be proactive in terms of thinking about impacts and suggesting specific mitigation measures. Now, a lot of maple producers are probably already familiar with buckthorn and garlic mustard, and those continue to be pesky and interfering with maple regeneration. So we've provided links to learn about how to manage or remove those species. Again, diversity of every species, age class, all of that is very helpful and very important here. And then the last impact that I want to touch on relates to changes in soil composition. So sugar maples require nutrient-rich, moderately moist soils. And that's something that is thrown off balance by earthworms, which are actually not native to Midwestern forests. They deplete the soil of nutrients, and they also exacerbate the effects of drought and extreme rainfall. And then acid rain has also been an issue in some places in recent decades. And so then that makes the soil more acidic than the sugar maples really like. And so this is an example of why thinking about red maples can be beneficial, because they are more adaptable to these sorts of changes. And soil composition is a topic that a lot of maple producers aren't accustomed to really thinking much about. So we recommend that they at least know what their soil composition and acidity is as kind of a baseline. The University of Minnesota has a soil testing lab that will do that for you to help you know which trees are likely to thrive in your woods. And it's obviously a bit easier to apply some sort of lime or fertilizer to a garden than it is to whole large woods. But that is something that some maple producers in Canada have started doing. They've been using mechanical spreaders or even doing it from the air. So in the coming years, that may be something that we see more producers here in the Midwest start to look into more seriously as well. But regardless of that, something important that everyone can do is to try to avoid spreading earthworms and other invasive species. So the soil can contain earthworm cocoons and eggs of invasive species that are really hard to spot. So basically just washing off the undercarriage of your vehicle or cleaning off your boots and your gear, that will really help slow the spread of earthworms. And that's a really important and easy to do thing that everyone can do to help slow their spread. So that's kind of the overview of the adaptation menu for maple syrup producers that I created. And so now I'll spend a few minutes talking about how, if you're involved in other aspects of climate adaptation, you might be able to create a similar document for your work. So just thinking briefly about the goal of an adaptation menu, it really is more than just providing information. You don't want your audience to just learn about these ideas. You are essentially seeking to change their behavior in some way. You want them to adopt different strategies that they haven't been using before. And so that's a bigger lift than just learning or providing information. So that's why it's important to approach this from a thoughtful, strategic standpoint. So the first thing I would suggest is to choose the scope of your menu strategically. So if you choose something with a really broad scope, like forests in North America, that's going to be applicable to a fairly large audience, but it runs the risk of not being very useful to that audience. Whereas if you have something with a more narrow scope, like the maple syrup production in the upper Midwest, that is going to have a much smaller audience, but if you do it well, it could have a very high usefulness to that audience. So there definitely is a time and a place for these broad scope documents. As I mentioned, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has a very detailed adaptation workbook, and those resources are valuable. But I think what we're missing in a lot of climate change communication is these documents that have a more narrow scope and really help people see how climate change applies to their specific communities and specific industries and what they can do to adapt. So I encourage folks to think about where those narrow scopes might be missing. Before you sit down to create an actual document, you need to think about where your audience is. What channels are they using to find information? How can you reach them? So in our case, we were helped with this by the fact that we ran a survey. Actually, the team did this before I joined the project, and they found that Wisconsin maple producers generally prefer to receive information either via written materials, via email, or browsing websites. And so this result helped us know that in addition to making the adaptation guide a web page, it would also be beneficial to create a PDF version that people could download and print to have that written material. So this doesn't mean that you shouldn't use other channels too, just means to make sure that you optimize the thing that you're creating for the channels where most of your audience is. And as I mentioned at the outset, knowing your audience is super crucial. And in the context of climate adaptation menus, there are several aspects of this that jump to mind to me. So the first one is to make sure to use language and imagery that will resonate with them. Climate change is a phrase that I'm sure you all have experienced can be very polarizing. So if you're working with an audience who is already on board, they want to help deal with climate change, they just don't know how yet, then really lean into that. But if that phrase is going to potentially alienate your audience, I suggest avoiding it entirely or at least de-emphasizing it. And instead going with something like changing weather patterns or resilience or stewardship or energy independence, and just like really talking with your audience and knowing which sorts of language will resonate with them. That should determine the language that you use. And in social science research, this concept is called framing. There's been a whole lot of research on it, which I will give some links to at the end. Secondly, when you're giving a climate information, there are a variety of sources that you could cite. It's important to cite the information sources that your audience will find trustworthy, not the ones that you as the communicator find trustworthy. So again, for some audiences, citing climate scientists or climate science data very explicitly and very directly might be an excellent way to go. But for other communities, you may instead want to think more broadly about sources like doctors or community or industry leaders, or even peers. In our case, we tried to cite many resources that were written by people with expertise in maple syrup production. And we also leaned on social norms a little bit, which is something I really encourage because social norms can be a really powerful driver of behavior change, especially if you can show that your audience's peers are already engaging in some of the adaptation strategies you're suggesting. Yes, someone says, don't forget framing by talking about economic impacts, especially for political conservatives. Yes, absolutely. And I think energy independence kind of plays into that as well. But yeah, definitely the economy can be a winning frame for a lot of audiences. And knowing your audience doesn't stop with that pre-research before you start creating the adaptation menu. You want this to be something that's usable for your audience. So ideally, you're engaging with them throughout the development process. And that can look a lot of ways. Maybe you're running surveys like we did, or interviews like I did as I was researching the menu. You also might want to even do focus groups or pilot testing in some more formal sense. So in our case, another survey question specifically asked about climate impacts, and we saw that prevalence of invasive species and timing of sugaring seasons were two topics that folks were especially concerned about. So we knew we had to make sure and address those directly in the menu. And profitability was something people were a little less certain about. So we decided to not include any sort of very detailed economic cost benefit analysis. That is something that could be a future step for a future iteration of the Maple climate adaptation menu. And when you think about content, I encourage you to think holistically and make sure you're including everything that could possibly be relevant without broadening the scope too much. Specifically, are you trying to focus on adaptation or mitigation or both? For those of us who are really steeped in the climate space, it can be easy to forget that people's motivations for engaging in adaptation actions versus mitigation actions can be quite different. And so it is important for us to keep that distinction in mind when we're thinking about how and whether to mention both of those different dimensions of climate action. In our case, maple producers are generally more concerned with adaptation than mitigation. Though I will mention as a side note that it is possible to be net zero carbon emissions in maple production. And there are a couple maple producers who are starting to try to pursue this in a quantitative way. But that's definitely not a majority of producers at this point. So that's why we focused much more on adaptation. And impacts not directly related to climate change can still be relevant. So especially when you're thinking about adaptation, the actions you're suggesting are not addressing the root cause. They're not addressing carbon emissions. They're just adapting to the new reality. And so in that sense, it doesn't really matter what the underlying cause is for your audience. So an example in our case was the earthworm situation. The earthworm scientist I spoke with said that earthworms aren't really being favored or disfavored by climate change. They're operating kind of separate from that, but they're still interacting with climate impacts. And so it makes sense to include that sort of information if it affects how your audience will need to respond to the other climate impacts that they're facing. And then the last thing is to allow for varying levels of engagement. So some sort of way for audience members to get a quick overview of the information and a way for them to dive into whatever information they want to learn more about. And that can look a lot of ways, but just make it easy for people to have either mode of engagement. And then lastly, this comes from a lot of social science research, focus on actions as much as you possibly can. If you're presenting a lot of scary information about climate impacts, that's going to discourage action. Whereas if you present that information along with information about efficacy, that will encourage action. I like to think of efficacy as an active form of hope. It's basically the sense that you can take actions and your actions will make a difference. So in our case, we spent about 3 times as many words talking about solutions as we did about the problems themselves. So some takeaways overall. Firstly, climate change is impacting maple syrup production and will continue to do so, but it's not having a catastrophic impact. We're still going to have maple syrup for quite a long time into the future. And there are many ways that producers can adapt their practices by being a good steward of the land and by being proactive with their business and technology strategies. And on the communication side, adaptation menus can be a really valuable way to connect these broader ideas of climate science and adaptation to local and industry specific actions. So I encourage you all to think about ways that you might be able to incorporate this sort of information into the way that you're interacting with folks on climate adaptation. Now, it's on the social science side of things. As I mentioned, I'm in a social science master's program, and so I really value evidence-based communication strategies. So here are some resources that I've found very helpful in terms of climate change communication, and I'm trying to paste these in the chat for you all as well. But it's not working, so I'll do them one at a time. And that's all I have. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions and go into more detail about any of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And webinars are always hard to have a round of applause, but a round of applause for Scott for a great presentation. And yes, please add your questions into the Q&A. And I see some folks add in compliments in the chat, so please also feel free to add those in the chat as well. I don't think we have any questions at the moment, but I did just want to say, Scott, I really liked what you just said about efficacy being, what did you call it?
An active form of hope.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How did you come to that philosophy?
I have been doing a lot of reading about like climate solutions and just different perspectives on the climate crisis in general. And Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, I've heard her talk about how she doesn't really like the idea of hope because it feels too passive to her. Like we're just, yes, climate change is going to be solved. It will all work out on its own. It's going to be fine. But that's not really true. Like we have the solutions we need, but we have to be active and put them into practice. And then in the context of social science research, efficacy is the term that gets thrown around a lot. And so as I've just been kind of thinking about how these ideas fit together, that was kind of the framing that really resonated with me.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I wrote that down as like an inspirational quote. So thank you. And then we do have one question here from Jay. Is there a difference in taste between sugar maple and red maple, or is it mostly the difference in sugar concentration for boiling or producing the syrup?
Yeah, good question. So I'd say the main difference is going to be in the sugar concentration. So red maple sap might take longer to oil. But what some recent research is finding is that a red maple will often produce more sap over the course of the season than a sugar maple. So the end yield of syrup might be about the same quantity. In terms of taste, a lot of the taste of syrup is determined by the relative concentrations of sucrose, fructose, and glucose in the sap. And basically, the more fructose and glucose you have, the darker the syrup will end up being, and that has a different flavor. So there can be some variation there. But in terms of just like inherent differences between sugar maples and red maples, I haven't seen any conclusive research on that. I think if you talk to maple producers, you'll hear a lot of them say that they do taste a difference. But I don't know like how much of that is placebo effect versus something actually chemically different about the syrup.
Yeah, they're probably also like very finely tuned to the taste of maple syrup. So I don't know if
For sure.
a broader audience would. I've been curious about that myself, though.
Yeah.
Oh, we have. Oh, this is from Stephen Hirschberger. What level of resistance from Wisconsin producers to discuss climate change impacts on their work, high versus low? Oh, I think that's talking about like the impact of like the high emission scenario, low emission scenario. That's my guess.
Can I see the question? Where's the Q&A? What level of
it's
resistance
just
from
yeah.
Wisconsin producers to discuss?
Oh, I see. No,
If that's more about discussion, I think this is one thing that makes it a little bit challenging is that there's a lot of variety. So there are plenty of Wisconsin maple producers who are very aware that climate change is happening and they use the phrase climate change and they want to adapt to climate change. And then there are others who are really resistant to that term, even if they are seeing changes in their woods that they want to try to deal with. And so for this adaptation menu, we decided to go with the more general, the less climate specific language in order to not alienate that portion of the audience, but to hopefully still connect with everyone. And we did provide some resources to stuff that is talking about specifically climate change. So for those folks who want to learn about it from a directly climate science related perspective, there's a way for them to do so.
Awesome. And we have a question from Riley. Why is climate change increasing deer populations?
Yeah, so I don't know all of the details on this one, but my understanding is that a lot of it is related to the milder winters. The milder winters just being easier to tolerate for deer.
Yeah, I've heard some things like that too, and then also just kind of we don't have as many apex predators like wolves, stuff like that. I think it's like a lot of stuff. But I've heard the milder winters too. And we have a question again from Jay. Do deer seem to like sugar maple more than other seedlings?
That's a question I do not know the answer to. Sorry about that.
I can say a little bit from when I planted seedlings, they do tend to like the maples. But it's not like their number one choice is what I've seen from the deer that have eaten my seedlings. But, I think we don't have any more questions at the moment. But I was also curious, you talked about this a little bit already, but the framing that works best for maple syrup producers. Could you say again, like what framing you felt worked most effectively?
So I would say stewardship of the land resonates with a lot of maple producers, particularly because a lot of them come from multiple generations of maple syrup producers. They've lived on the same land for generations and really have that close relationship with the land. And they highly value their role beyond just producing some commodity of maple syrup. They view their role as being a steward of the woods and of the ecosystem more generally. And so that's why the stewardship of the land resonates. And then resilience as well, just because maple syrup production is so dependent on those freeze thaw cycles. So some years you'll have a really short maple season, some years it might be two weeks, some years it might be 8 weeks. And so just being able to adapt to that year in and year out and build in the resilience to your overall approach to be able to handle those changes is something that maple producers are already accustomed to thinking about.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful. And I also really appreciated the process you shared on developing an adaptation menu. That's something that's on my mind a lot. And what did you mention what brought you to maple syrup, like to being interested in maple syrup producers?
No, I didn't say that yet. It was less intentional than you might think. I really just kind of stumbled upon it because I had already started the master's program here, and I was looking for applied science communication projects to get involved with, particularly through extension. And there's a professor in my department who was already working on this maple syrup project. And so when I talked to him about the different things he was working on, he mentioned the maple syrup project as one to get involved in. And so I didn't really know anything about maple syrup beforehand. I grew up in Kansas, which is outside of the sugar maple production range. But in terms of climate change, there's a lot of intricacies to our food systems and how that fits into it. And so once I started learning about it, I became fascinated.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of climate change and ways we can adapt, and also like a less dire story in some cases with maple syrup, at least here, that it's something we might be able to adapt and like hold on to.
Yeah. I've definitely seen some articles written for a general audience that are like raising the alarm saying, oh, your breakfast is going to be without maple syrup in the next 40 years. But like, that's not the case at all. Like it's going to be okay. And so that's, again, from a communication perspective, why it's important to have that balance of fear and efficacy, because if you just give fear and blow things way out of proportion, that's going to be counterproductive. People aren't going to take action then. But if you show them, here are the things that you can do to address something that is a real challenge, but is addressable, then you're much more likely to get that behavior change.
And I noticed we have one more question from Stephen in the Q&A, and it's, what early reactions have you received from your prototype adaptation menu? Any changes for new revisions?
Right. So we haven't, at least I haven't interacted extensively with maple producers about this menu since we created it. I'm hoping to have the opportunity to do that in the next couple months. I do know that one of the folks with the Cornell Maple program mentioned something that's not discussed on the menu is this challenge of storing sap once it's been collected, because sap is perishable. Their bacteria and yeast grows and it spoils. And so sap has to be kept cold and ideally boiled within like a day or at most a week of being collected. And so when temperatures are warmer in general, that creates more of a challenge. So that's something that's not addressed in this current version of the menu, but is something that we may think about adding in future iterations of it.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I've definitely learned the hard way, at least with my own bottles of maple syrup, that it is in fact perishable.
Yeah, I mean, once it's in syrup form, it's much more shelf stable than the sap, just because the high concentration of sugar prevents that bacterial growth.
And we've got one question from Don that's in the chat here. What kind of funding is needed to develop and maintain such a nice website and menu?
Yeah, so in our case, the funding that we have is a 3-year grant from the USDA, specifically focused on projects that support the maple industry. And the project is planning to continue after that, apply for more funding. that sort of thing. So the menu, the menu fits within that broader context. So that's what the website is. It's part of that broader program. The menu itself doesn't necessarily have to be super expensive to create. Because again, in my case, I read some research, I interviewed people coming at the topic from a variety of perspectives, and I kind of consolidated that information and wrote it up. So you really need people resources more than anything else. You need someone's time to do that thoughtful research and synthesizing of information and any sort of testing that you're going to do. So I think it's possible to do as kind of a one-off project. If you get like a small grant, I think it would be possible to do something like this as a one-off, or in our case, as part of a larger grant.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to pull up the closing slides quick.
Yep.
And we can happily answer any questions that pop up in the last few minutes, but we're approaching 1 o'clock soon. So we do have a brief closing survey just about our webinar series. And so, Rick, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up, we take your feedback really seriously, and we're working on, we're starting to look to 2024, which is pretty wild, as we're formulating our series. So yeah, please fill that out if you have the chance. And then if you are curious about more Minnesota climate news, you can use this QR code or the Z link to get updates from MCAP and learn more. And then that's all I have. Thank you. We really appreciate everyone participating. And Scott, we're so thankful to have you here today, sharing your knowledge and expertise on communication, maple syrup, and the adaptation menu that you created. And I really appreciate the way that you weave together kind of that process of the adaptation menu, but also then the results and impacts on maple and maple syrup producers. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope to stay connected, and yeah, we can think about maybe some, if you would be interested, some options for looking at Minnesota and some of our maple syrup production here. I don't know if you've connected with Gary Wyatt at all, but he's somebody that is an extension that more agroforestry. I think you and him would be a good connection too. So
cool.
But thank you again, and we'll have this webinar up on our YouTube channel within usually about a week, and we'll share that back with you. So thank you again, and I guess we'll close out for the day, but yeah, really excited and thankful to have you with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.